A blind king should never have known she was smiling. The carriage wheels rolled through fresh snow as Emily Parker pressed her hand against the cold window and stared at the distant silhouette of Blackwood Palace rising above the winter hills. The kingdom's most powerful residence looked less like a home and more like a fortress carved from ice and stone. Tall towers pierced the gray morning sky. Royal banners moved slowly in the wind. Even from nearly half a mile away, the palace carried an air of quiet authority that made her sit a little straighter in her seat. She had dreamed of seeing it since she was a child. She simply had not imagined arriving under such circumstances. 3 days earlier, shocking news had spread across the kingdom. Alpha King Damien Blackwood, the ruler whose decisions shaped entire territories, had reportedly lost his sight after a mysterious illness. Merchants whispered about it in crowded markets. Noble families discussed it behind closed doors. Travelers carried the story from town to town. Nobody seemed to know exactly what had happened, only that the once unstoppable Alpha King could no longer see the world around him. Emily adjusted the sleeves of her simple blue dress and tried to calm the nervous energy in her chest. At 24 years old, she had spent most of her life working in small estates and provincial households. Now she had been selected to join the royal staff itself. It should have felt like the opportunity of a lifetime. Instead, uncertainty followed every thought. The carriage finally passed through the enormous palace gates. Guards in black uniforms stood motionless despite the cold. Servants crossed the courtyards carrying baskets, documents, and supplies. Everything moved with remarkable precision. Yet beneath the order, Emily sensed something else. Tension. The kind that lingered when people were trying not to speak about something everyone was thinking. She stepped from the carriage and immediately felt winter air brush against her face. Snow covered the gardens. Frozen fountains glittered beneath pale sunlight. A senior housekeeper greeted her with a hurried expression and began leading her through a maze of hallways. Their footsteps echoed across polished marble floors. "You will receive your full duties later," the woman explained. "For now, you're assigned to assist His Majesty directly." Emily nearly stopped walking. "Directly?" The housekeeper nodded. "The king requires additional staff." Something about the answer felt incomplete, but Emily did not press further. They continued through long corridors decorated with portraits, banners, and crystal lamps. Servants stepped aside whenever they passed. Some whispered quietly to one another. Others lowered their voices altogether. By the time they reached the royal wing, Emily's nerves had returned in full force. The housekeeper paused outside a large wooden door. "Remember your manners. Speak clearly. Follow instructions." Then she opened the door. Warm firelight illuminated a spacious sitting room lined with bookshelves and tall windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. A man stood near one of the windows. His back faced the entrance. He was taller than Emily expected. Broad-shouldered. Perfectly still. Even without seeing his face, she immediately knew who he was. Damien Blackwood turned slowly at the sound of the opening door. His dark suit was impeccably tailored. His expression remained calm and unreadable. Yet it was his eyes that drew Emily's attention. They appeared distant somehow, focused on nothing she could identify. For a moment the room became completely silent. Emily lowered her gaze respectfully. "Your Majesty." Damien acknowledged her with a slight nod. "You are the new maid." His voice was steady, deep, and surprisingly gentle. "Yes, Your Majesty. Emily Parker." Another brief silence followed. Emily expected questions. Instructions. Something formal. Instead, the king simply stood there as though listening to sounds nobody else could hear. The crackle of the fireplace. The wind beyond the windows. The faint ticking of a clock somewhere deeper in the room. Finally, he spoke again. "You traveled from Oak Ridge County." Emily blinked. "Yes." Confusion immediately followed. She had not mentioned Oak Ridge. Nobody had. The housekeeper looked equally surprised. Damien's expression never changed. "The roads there are rough this time of year." Emily hesitated. "They are, Your Majesty." For the briefest moment, something about the exchange felt strange. Then she dismissed the thought. Of course the palace would know where new staff members came from. That information was probably recorded somewhere. The explanation seemed reasonable. Yet as Damien turned his head slightly toward the window, Emily could not shake the feeling that something about the encounter was not what it appeared to be. Outside, snow continued falling across Blackwood Palace. Inside, the first chapter of a story neither of them expected had quietly begun. The next morning arrived beneath a blanket of fresh snow that covered Blackwood Palace in brilliant white. Emily Parker woke before sunrise and followed the routine assigned to every member of the royal staff, yet nothing about her new position felt ordinary. Throughout breakfast, whispers drifted between servants seated along the long dining tables. Every conversation eventually returned to the same subject: the blind king. Some spoke with sympathy. Others spoke with curiosity. A few seemed strangely relieved. Emily listened quietly while stirring her tea. She had only met Damien Blackwood once, yet something about him remained fixed in her thoughts. More specifically, something about the previous evening refused to make sense. After reporting to the royal wing, Emily received her first official duties. She was expected to assist the king throughout the day by organizing correspondence, reading selected documents aloud, and helping him navigate areas of the palace when necessary. The instructions sounded straightforward enough. Yet when she entered Damien's private study later that morning, she immediately sensed the same unusual atmosphere she had noticed before. The room was warm despite the winter cold outside. Sunlight filtered through tall windows overlooking snow-covered gardens. Hundreds of books lined dark wooden shelves from floor to ceiling. Damien sat near the fireplace reviewing documents placed neatly across a large desk. His expression remained calm as always. Emily approached quietly. "Good morning, Your Majesty." Damien nodded slightly. "Good morning, Emily." Hearing her name still surprised her. She had introduced herself only once. Before she could speak again, Damien gestured toward a stack of papers resting several feet away. "The trade reports are on the left side of the desk." Emily paused. The reports were indeed on the left side. Her eyes moved toward them automatically. Then confusion returned. How did he know she was looking for them? Perhaps someone arranged them there earlier. Perhaps he remembered where they had been placed. The explanation seemed reasonable. Yet uncertainty lingered. Throughout the morning, Emily read correspondence aloud while Damien listened. Foreign trade agreements. Agricultural reports. Requests from local governors. Occasionally, he asked questions. Occasionally, he requested specific sections be repeated. What surprised Emily most was how attentive he remained. He seemed to absorb every detail. More than once, he corrected small numerical mistakes made by advisors who had prepared summaries. His memory appeared extraordinary. Around midday, several nobles arrived for a private meeting. Emily remained in the room to assist if needed. The difference in their behavior immediately caught her attention. Their words remained respectful, but something had changed beneath the surface. One noble spoke more casually than protocol normally allowed. Another interrupted the king twice during a discussion. A third seemed eager to explain matters Damien clearly already understood. Emily found herself uncomfortable watching it. They treated him differently now. Not openly disrespectful. Not yet. But differently. As though losing his sight had somehow reduced him. Damien never reacted. He remained composed and courteous. Yet Emily noticed his fingers resting quietly against the arm of his chair whenever certain comments were made. He heard everything. He missed nothing. The meeting finally ended. Once the nobles departed, silence settled over the study again. Emily gathered documents while Damien stood near the window. Snowflakes drifted outside. For several moments neither spoke. Then Damien surprised her. "You seem troubled." Emily nearly dropped the papers she was holding. "I am sorry? Something is bothering you." Emily stared at him. The observation was accurate. Uncomfortably accurate. She hesitated before answering. "I was only thinking about the meeting." Damien remained facing the window. "And?" Emily lowered her eyes toward the documents. "I think some people forget who they are speaking to." Silence followed. Then, for the first time, a faint smile appeared at the corner of Damien's mouth. Not amusement. Appreciation. That is an honest observation. Emily immediately felt embarrassed. Perhaps she had spoken too freely. Yet Damien seemed neither offended nor surprised. The smile disappeared as quickly as it came. Outside, winter sunlight reflected across the snow-covered gardens. Inside the study, Emily returned to organizing reports while a strange realization slowly formed. Since arriving at the palace, she had seen fear, pity, curiosity, and calculation directed toward the king. But she had not once seen anyone simply treat him like a person. Anyone except perhaps herself. And somehow, without looking at her, Damien Blackwood seemed to know that. 3 days passed, and with each passing day Emily Parker became more certain that something inside Blackwood Palace was changing. The change was subtle enough that most visitors would never notice it, yet once she saw it, she could not stop seeing it. People spoke differently around Damien Blackwood now. They still bowed. They still used proper titles. They still followed royal protocol. But respect had begun separating from sincerity. Emily noticed it first among the servants. During meals, conversations became increasingly careless whenever the king's condition was mentioned. Some expressed pity. Others spoke about palace politics as though Damien were no longer capable of understanding complex matters. One afternoon, while carrying records to the royal study, Emily overheard 2 junior attendants laughing quietly near a corridor window. "He cannot even see who enters the room anymore," one whispered. "Half the court has already stopped fearing him." The other smiled. Power changes quickly. Emily continued walking without interrupting them, but the words lingered in her thoughts long afterward. That same afternoon, snow covered the palace gardens in a fresh layer of white. Winter sunlight reflected brightly through the tall windows of the study where Damien spent much of his day. Emily sat at a small table reading correspondence while the king listened beside the fireplace. The room felt peaceful. The crackling fire softened the silence. Occasionally Damien asked a question about a report. Occasionally he requested that she repeat a paragraph. Yet what impressed Emily most was how carefully he listened. He seemed to notice details others overlooked. A governor's unusual wording. A merchant's hidden concern. A diplomat's change in tone. Nothing escaped him. As she finished reading one document, a senior advisor entered the room carrying several reports. The man bowed respectfully before approaching the king. "Your Majesty, these require your approval." Damien nodded. "Leave them on the desk." The advisor complied. Yet instead of departing immediately, he remained standing nearby. Something about his expression bothered Emily. The man spoke politely, but there was a trace of confidence she had not noticed before. Almost as though he believed himself less accountable now. The conversation continued for several minutes. Then the advisor referenced a figure from a recent trade report. Emily immediately recognized the number as incorrect. She had read the original report that morning. The mistake was obvious. She hesitated. Correcting a senior advisor was not her place. Before she could decide whether to speak, Damien calmly replied. The actual figure was 842,000, not 720,000. Silence followed. The advisor blinked. "You are correct, Your Majesty." Emily lowered her eyes toward the papers in her lap. Once again, Damien had identified an error without hesitation. The advisor quickly changed the subject. When the meeting ended and the door closed behind him, Emily finally allowed herself to wonder what she had been avoiding for days. How was he doing this? A blind man should not have possessed such awareness. Yet every day seemed to produce another example. Every conversation raised another question. The strange feeling returned later that evening. Emily accompanied Damien during a short walk through one of the quieter palace corridors. Snow tapped softly against distant windows. The hall was nearly empty. She remained a respectful step behind him, prepared to assist if necessary. Yet Damien never reached for support. Never hesitated. Never misjudged distance. He moved with calm confidence through unfamiliar shadows and changing light. At one point, a decorative table had been moved several inches from its usual position by cleaning staff. Emily noticed it immediately and prepared to warn him. Before she could speak, Damien adjusted his path slightly and walked around it without difficulty. Her footsteps slowed. The king continued forward. Emily stared at the table behind them. A chill unrelated to winter moved through her chest. Perhaps he had memorized the corridor. Perhaps someone informed him earlier. There was always an explanation. Yet the explanations were becoming increasingly difficult to believe. That night, after returning to her small room in the servants' wing, Emily sat beside the window watching snow drift beneath the moonlight. The palace looked beautiful from above. Quiet, peaceful, untouched by uncertainty. Yet uncertainty filled her thoughts. She remembered the first day. The way Damien somehow knew where she came from. The way he sensed emotions people never voiced. The mistakes he corrected. The obstacles he avoided. The details he seemed to notice despite his condition. None of it made sense. And for the first time since arriving at Blackwood Palace, Emily found herself asking a question she never imagined she would consider. What if the king was hiding something from everyone? The question followed Emily Parker through the next several days like a shadow she could not quite catch. Every explanation she considered eventually collapsed beneath the weight of another strange observation. Yet, despite her growing suspicions, she said nothing. She was new to Blackwood Palace. Accusing the Alpha King of hiding something would be absurd. And yet, the doubts remained. Winter settled deeper across the kingdom. Snow accumulated along balconies and palace rooftops. Morning frost painted delicate patterns across tall windows. Inside the royal wing, life continued according to routine. Emily read reports, organized correspondence, assisted Damien Blackwood throughout his daily schedule. To everyone else, the arrangement appeared perfectly ordinary. Only Emily knew how unusual it felt. One afternoon, while delivering documents to the palace library, she discovered a room unlike anything she had seen before. Hidden beyond a pair of carved oak doors stood one of the largest collections of books in the kingdom. Shelves stretched upward nearly 30 feet. Ancient manuscripts occupied locked display cases. Maps from distant territories covered entire walls. Sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, covering the floor in pools of gold, blue, and crimson light. Emily stopped walking and stared. She had always loved books. Knowledge fascinated her. As a child, she spent evenings reading borrowed volumes while other children played outside. Even after beginning work as a servant, she continued studying whenever opportunities appeared. Standing inside the royal library felt like entering a dream. She spent several minutes helping librarians organize recent acquisitions before noticing a small group gathered around a large table near the center of the room. 3 palace scholars stood there examining a collection of old documents. Their expressions suggested frustration. One of them sighed heavily. Another shook his head. Curious, Emily glanced toward the table while carrying a stack of books. A page covered with unfamiliar symbols lay open beneath a lamp. She recognized the script immediately. Her footsteps slowed. The scholars continued debating. The phrase makes no sense, one insisted. The translation contradicts the previous section. Another scholar disagreed. Then the earlier translation must be wrong. Emily hesitated. She had no intention of interrupting. Yet as she listened, it became obvious that both interpretations contained mistakes. The text was not written in a single language. It combined elements from multiple historical dialects. Anyone translating it literally would reach the wrong conclusion. She quietly continued working. The discussion lasted another 20 minutes. Voices grew increasingly frustrated. Finally, one of the scholars pushed back his chair. We have been arguing about this for 2 weeks. Emily looked down at the books in her arms. Her heart began beating faster. Speaking would be inappropriate. Yet remaining silent felt equally wrong. Before she could lose her courage, she stepped closer. Excuse me. 3 scholars turned toward her. Surprise appeared immediately. Emily swallowed nervously. I think the problem is the third symbol. One scholar raised an eyebrow. The third symbol? Emily nodded. She carefully pointed toward the document. It is not part of the northern dialect. It belongs to an older coastal language. The phrase changes meaning if both languages are read together. Silence filled the table. The scholars exchanged uncertain looks. Emily continued speaking, now focused entirely on the manuscript. She explained how the symbols interacted. She described the historical context. She translated several lines. What began as hesitation gradually transformed into confidence. The text unfolded naturally in her mind. When she finally finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. One scholar slowly lowered his glasses. Another looked back at the manuscript. The third reread Emily's translation twice. That? He said quietly. That actually works. Emily immediately wished she could disappear. Attention had never been comfortable. She lowered her eyes. I am sorry if I interrupted. Interrupted? The oldest scholar looked astonished. Miss Parker, you just solved a problem that has occupied 3 royal historians for nearly 14 days. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. She offered an awkward smile. The scholars quickly returned to the manuscript, verifying each section. One by one their confusion disappeared. The translation was correct. None of them understood how a palace maid possessed such knowledge. Neither did most people who crossed paths with Emily. By evening, word of the incident had quietly traveled through portions of the palace. Not as gossip, as curiosity. Meanwhile, in his private study, Damien Blackwood listened as one of the scholars described exactly what had happened. The Alpha King remained silent throughout the report. His expression revealed nothing. Yet after the scholar departed, Damien stood near the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. A faint smile touched his face. Not because he was surprised. Because he was not. From the moment Emily Parker arrived at Blackwood Palace, she had been different from everyone else. And with each passing day, she was becoming more difficult to overlook. The incident in the Royal Library should have faded into palace memory within a day or two. Instead, it seemed to follow Emily Parker wherever she went. She noticed it first in the way people looked at her. Librarians greeted her with unexpected enthusiasm. Junior scholars suddenly asked for her opinion on obscure historical references. Even a few senior officials who had barely acknowledged her existence before now paused to exchange polite words. The attention made her uncomfortable. She had never sought recognition. She certainly had not intended to impress anyone. She had simply answered a question because she knew the answer. Yet inside Blackwood Palace, even small moments had a way of traveling farther than expected. Snow continued falling across the kingdom. Winter sunlight appeared only briefly each day before fading behind thick clouds. One quiet morning, Emily arrived in Damien Blackwood's study carrying several reports gathered from different departments. The room looked much as it always did. A fire burned softly in the hearth. Shelves filled with books surrounded the walls. Outside the tall windows, snow drifted across the gardens. Damien sat near the fireplace reviewing correspondence. His expression remained calm, unreadable, and somehow more observant than ever. Emily placed the reports neatly upon the desk. The weekly trade summaries, Your Majesty. Damien nodded. Thank you. She expected the conversation to end there. Instead, Damien spoke again. I heard you visited the library. Emily immediately understood what he meant. Heat rose to her cheeks. Only to deliver records. And solve a translation problem that challenged 3 scholars. Emily lowered her gaze. It was not as impressive as people are making it sound. A faint smile touched Damien's face. Interesting. Emily looked up. What is? Most people spend their lives searching for opportunities to appear impressive. He paused. You seem determined to avoid them. Emily did not know how to answer. The truth was simple. Attention often created expectations. Expectations created disappointment. She preferred her books, her work, and the quiet satisfaction of solving problems nobody noticed. Damien seemed to study her silence. Then he unexpectedly reached toward a nearby shelf and removed a thin volume. Read this passage. Emily accepted the book. The text contained a mixture of historical commentary and foreign terminology. She began reading aloud. After several paragraphs, Damien interrupted. Translate the final section. Emily glanced down. The language changed near the end. Not difficult. Just uncommon. She translated it smoothly. Damien nodded once. And the phrase beneath it? Another language. Emily translated that one as well. Then another. Then another. Several sections later, she finally lowered the book. Damien remained silent. The fire crackled softly between them. Emily suddenly realized something. None of these questions had been random. He had been testing her. The realization should have bothered her. Instead, curiosity replaced discomfort. Your Majesty, she asked carefully, how many languages are in that book? 7. Emily blinked. Damien leaned back slightly. You recognized all of them. For a moment neither spoke. Snow tapped gently against the windows. Somewhere beyond the study, distant footsteps echoed through the corridor. Damien's expression remained thoughtful. Not surprised. Thoughtful. As though each answer merely confirmed something he already suspected. The conversation ended shortly afterward, but similar exchanges continued throughout the week. Sometimes Damien asked questions about history. Sometimes geography. Sometimes diplomatic customs from territories hundreds of miles away. Emily answered as best she could. Occasionally, she admitted. She did not know. More often, she found herself explaining concepts she had learned through years of independent study. What surprised her most was how carefully Damien listened. Most people listened only long enough to respond. Damien listened to understand. By the end of the week, another realization had begun forming inside Emily's mind. The Alpha King was not asking questions because he doubted her abilities. He was measuring them. Meanwhile, across the kingdom, a different problem was beginning to emerge. Messengers arrived more frequently. Advisors moved through the palace with growing urgency. Meetings extended late into the evening. Trade officials appeared increasingly concerned. Emily noticed the signs without fully understanding them. Something important was happening beyond the palace walls. Something serious enough to draw the attention of every major department. One snowy evening, as she organized correspondence near Damien's desk, a senior advisor entered carrying several sealed documents. His expression was unusually tense. He placed the papers before the king. Your Majesty, the delegation from Norhaven arrives tomorrow. Silence settled across the room. Damien looked toward the advisor. Earlier than expected. Yes, Your Majesty. The advisor hesitated. And there appears to be a problem with the treaty documents. Emily felt the atmosphere shift immediately. The advisor continued speaking. Our translators cannot agree on the original text. Damien said nothing for several moments. Then he slowly turned his head toward the window, where snow continued falling beyond the glass. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Emily did not yet understand why. But somewhere deep inside, she sensed that everything was about to change. The following morning arrived beneath a sky the color of polished steel. Snow covered every rooftop, balcony, and courtyard within Blackwood Palace. Yet, despite the peaceful appearance of the kingdom, tension moved through the halls like an invisible current. Emily Parker sensed it the moment she stepped into the royal wing. Servants hurried more quickly than usual. Advisors carried stacks of documents from one office to another. Guards maintained their positions with unusual alertness. Something important was unfolding. By mid-morning, the delegation from Norhaven had arrived. Their carriages rolled through the palace gates beneath fluttering banners while palace officials gathered to receive them. The visitors represented one of Blackwood Kingdom's most valuable trading partners. Maintaining that relationship was essential. Everyone understood what was at stake. Unfortunately, everyone also understood there was a problem. Emily learned more details later while organizing correspondence in Damien Blackwood's study. Several senior advisors stood around a large table covered with maps, treaties, and translation notes. Their expressions revealed growing frustration. One scholar insisted the original treaty contained a promise regarding trade routes. Another argued the document referenced taxation instead. A third claimed both interpretations were incomplete. The disagreement had apparently continued for days. Nobody could determine which translation was correct. The room fell silent as Damien listened. His expression remained composed, but Emily noticed the slight tension near his jaw. The situation was serious. A misunderstanding during negotiations could damage years of cooperation between the two kingdoms. One advisor finally sighed. "Your Majesty, we have consulted every translator available within the palace." Another added, "The original document appears to combine several historical dialects. No one can agree on the intended meaning." Emily continued organizing papers quietly near a bookshelf. The treaty discussion was far above her position. Yet when one advisor placed a copied page of the disputed text onto the table, something immediately caught her attention. Even from several feet away, the writing looked familiar. Not entirely familiar, but familiar enough. She tried to focus on her work. The meeting continued. Advisors debated sentence structures. Historians referenced old records. Translators defended competing interpretations. The more they discussed the document, the more confused the situation seemed to become. Nearly an hour passed. Eventually, though, advisors gathered their notes and prepared for an afternoon meeting with the Norhaven delegation. The atmosphere remained unsettled. Once the room emptied, Emily approached the desk to collect abandoned papers. Her eyes fell briefly upon the copied treaty page. She froze. Recognition arrived instantly. The document did not contain one language. It contained three. More importantly, the translators had approached the text incorrectly. They were reading it line by line. The original authors intended it to be read in sections grouped by cultural context. Emily stared at the page. Her pulse quickened. The mistake suddenly seemed obvious. She should have looked away. She should have continued her duties. Instead, curiosity won. She examined several passages more closely. The meaning began unfolding piece by piece. Across the room, Damien stood near the window overlooking the snow-covered gardens. Without turning around, he spoke. "You recognize something." Emily nearly jumped. For a moment she considered denying it. Then she remembered who she was speaking to. Somehow Damien always seemed to notice more than anyone else. "Maybe," she admitted carefully. Silence followed. Then Damien asked a simple question. "What do you see?" Emily looked down at the treaty again. The words no longer appeared confusing. They appeared precise, deliberate, elegant even. She explained what she noticed. The mixture of dialects, the cultural references, the reason certain phrases seemed contradictory when translated literally. As she spoke, her confidence gradually increased. Every section connected to the next. Every apparent inconsistency disappeared. When she finally finished, the study became completely silent. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Fire crackled softly in the hearth. Damien remained motionless for several seconds. Then he slowly turned toward her. "You are certain?" Emily nodded. "Yes, Your Majesty." Another pause followed, long enough for Emily to wonder whether she had overstepped. Then Damien spoke again. "Prepare your notes." She blinked. "My notes?" "The delegation meeting begins in 1 hour." Emily stared at him. Surely he did not mean what she thought he meant. Yet, Damien's expression remained calm and completely serious. Outside the study, advisors continued preparing for difficult negotiations. Inside, Emily felt her heart begin racing. For weeks she had hidden quietly among books, records, and palace routines. In 1 hour, she might be standing inside the most important diplomatic meeting of the year. And somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the moment approaching would change far more than a single treaty. The conference chamber seemed larger than Emily Parker remembered. Perhaps it was the number of people gathered inside. Perhaps it was the weight of what was at stake. Tall windows overlooked a landscape buried beneath fresh snow. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished stone floors. Representatives from Norhaven occupied one side of the enormous table, while Blackwood Kingdom's advisors, historians, and translators sat opposite them. Every seat was filled. Every face carried tension. Emily remained near the back of the room beside several palace attendants. She still could not fully believe she had been invited to attend. Less than an hour earlier, she had been organizing correspondence in the royal study. Now she stood inside the most important diplomatic meeting of the year. At the head of the table sat Damien Blackwood. His expression remained calm and unreadable. To most observers, he appeared focused entirely on listening. Emily had learned enough by now to know that silence often meant he was paying attention more closely than anyone else. The negotiations began formally. Greetings were exchanged. Previous agreements were reviewed. Then the disputed treaty was presented. Immediately, the atmosphere shifted. Advisors referenced translation notes. Historians cited conflicting interpretations. Norhaven representatives politely challenged several conclusions. The deeper the discussion progressed, the more obvious the problem became. Nobody could establish a definitive translation. Hours of preparation seemed to unravel in real time. Frustration gradually replaced confidence. One translator insisted a particular section referred to shipping rights. Another argued it described seasonal tariffs. A third claimed the text addressed neither topic. The disagreement spread across the room like ripples in water. Voices remained respectful, but uncertainty grew stronger with every passing minute. Emily watched quietly from her position near the wall. The copied treaty rested open on the table. She recognized the same passages she had examined earlier. The same misunderstood phrases. The same hidden structure. Her heart beat faster. She had prepared notes exactly as Damien requested. Yet standing among senior diplomats and scholars felt very different from studying documents alone. What if she was wrong? What if she embarrassed herself? What if she embarrassed the kingdom? Across the room, one advisor finally sighed and leaned back in his chair. We are discussing the same sentences repeatedly. A Norhaven representative nodded. Because no one can agree what they actually mean. Silence followed. Heavy. Uncomfortable. The kind of silence that appears when nobody knows how to move forward. Then Damien spoke. His voice remained calm. Emily. Every head in the room turned. Emily froze. For a brief moment she considered pretending she had not heard him. Then reality returned. There was no escape. She stepped forward. The attention of nearly 24 officials followed her. Some appeared confused. Others looked skeptical. One translator actually frowned. Emily reached the table and looked down at the treaty. Her hands felt cold despite the warmth of the room. Damien's expression never changed. Yet something about his presence steadied her nerves. He simply said, "Explain." Emily took a slow breath. Then she began. At first her voice sounded quieter than she intended. She explained how the document combined 3 historical dialects. She described cultural references unique to coastal trading communities. She pointed out symbols that changed meaning depending on which section preceded them. Several officials exchanged uncertain looks. Emily continued. The more she spoke, the clearer the text became. Sentences that seemed contradictory suddenly aligned. Confusing phrases revealed precise intentions. Entire sections transformed once the correct cultural context was applied. 20 minutes earlier the treaty had looked impossible. Now its meaning unfolded naturally across the room. One representative from Norhaven leaned forward. Another began comparing her explanation against original records. Several scholars quickly reviewed notes. The skepticism slowly disappeared. Surprise replaced it. Then astonishment. By the time Emily reached the final section, nobody interrupted. Nobody argued. The room had become completely silent except for her voice. When she finished, the silence remained. Snow drifted beyond the windows. Crystal lights reflected across polished wood. Every person present stared at the treaty. Then at Emily. Then back at the treaty. Finally, the senior Norhaven representative smiled. That is the correct interpretation. The statement landed like a stone dropped into still water. Several Blackwood advisors immediately reviewed the text again. One scholar shook his head in disbelief. Another laughed softly, not from amusement, but relief. Weeks of confusion had vanished within minutes. Emily suddenly became aware of every eye in the room. Her face warmed. She wished she could disappear into the nearest wall. Yet there was nowhere to hide. Across the table, Damien Blackwood remained perfectly still. But for the briefest moment, a faint expression appeared in his eyes. Not surprise. Pride. And as officials throughout the chamber began realizing exactly what had happened, Emily sensed that this moment would be remembered long after the treaty itself was forgotten. The treaty meeting ended successfully, but the effect it left behind continued spreading through Blackwood Palace long after the delegates departed. By evening, nearly everyone seemed to know what had happened. Advisors discussed it in corridors. Scholars revisited notes they had dismissed only days earlier. Servants exchanged quiet conversations during dinner. A palace maid had solved a diplomatic problem that experts could not. The story sounded unbelievable. Yet it was true. Emily Parker wished people would stop talking about it. Attention had become impossible to avoid. Every time she entered a room, conversations shifted. Curious eyes followed her. Some people appeared impressed. Others seemed confused. A few looked openly skeptical. Emily preferred the archives, libraries, and quiet corners of the palace where books never judged anyone. Unfortunately, peace became increasingly difficult to find. 2 days after the treaty meeting, the royal court assembled for a formal gathering. Representatives from Norhaven remained at the palace for final discussions before returning home. Nobles filled the assembly chamber. Advisors occupied their usual positions. Scholars and diplomats lined the outer rows. Sunlight streamed through enormous stained glass windows, painting the marble floor with colors of gold, blue, and crimson. Emily stood near the back of the chamber among palace staff. She had no reason to expect anything unusual. The treaty had been resolved. Her role was finished. Or so she believed. At the front of the room sat Damien Blackwood upon the royal dais. As always, his posture remained composed. His expression revealed little. Yet Emily had spent enough time around him to recognize subtle differences. Today, something felt different. The court session proceeded normally at first. Trade matters were reviewed. Regional reports were discussed. Several advisors presented updates from neighboring territories. Everything followed established protocol. Then one noble unexpectedly mentioned the recent treaty negotiations. Another quickly referenced Emily's contribution. The room stirred with interest. Some nobles nodded politely. Others exchanged uncertain looks. A few appeared uncomfortable. One older court member spoke carefully. Remarkable work from a palace servant. Another added, quite unusual. Emily immediately wished the conversation would move elsewhere. Standing in the center of attention felt worse than solving any treaty. She lowered her eyes and hoped the discussion would end. Instead, it continued. Questions emerged. How had she learned those languages? Where had she studied? Why had nobody known about her abilities? The chamber filled with speculation. Through it all, Damien remained silent. Listening. Watching. Waiting. Then something happened that Emily never expected. A senior noble stood and addressed the court. His words remained polite, but the meaning beneath them was impossible to miss. Talent is valuable, he said. Yet positions of influence require more than knowledge. Several nobles nodded. The implication hung in the air. Emily understood it immediately. To some members of the court, she would always be a servant first, and everything else second. No amount of knowledge changed that. A familiar disappointment settled quietly inside her chest. Not because the opinion surprised her. Because it did not. For years she had seen the same pattern repeated. People noticed titles before character. Status before ability. Appearance before truth. Across the room, silence followed the noble statement. Then Damien Blackwood slowly rose from his chair. Every conversation stopped. Every eye turned toward the Alpha King. The chamber became completely still. Emily looked up. Damien stepped forward. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then he descended the steps of the dais without assistance. No guide. No attendant. No hesitation. Gasps echoed throughout the chamber. Several nobles straightened abruptly in their seats. Advisors exchanged stunned looks. The room seemed frozen in place. Damien continued walking across the marble floor with calm confidence. Not the careful movements of a blind man. The unmistakable movements of someone who could see exactly where he was going. Emily's heart stopped. Her mind struggled to process what she was witnessing. Every strange moment from the past several weeks returned at once. The corridor table. The trade reports. The way he sensed emotions before anyone spoke. The questions. The observations. The impossible awareness. Suddenly, everything made sense. Damien reached the center of the chamber and turned toward the assembled court. Shock covered nearly every face. Some nobles looked pale. Others appeared completely speechless. Emily could barely breathe. The truth stood before all of them now, impossible to ignore. Damien's gaze moved across the room. Calm. Steady. Certain. Then, for the first time since Emily arrived at Blackwood Palace, the greatest secret in the kingdom no longer belonged to the shadows. And every person present understood that nothing would ever be quite the same again. Silence filled the royal assembly chamber so completely that even the faint crackling of distant fireplace logs seemed loud. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The revelation stood before them all, impossible to deny. Damien Blackwood, the Alpha King whom the entire kingdom believed had lost his sight, had just crossed the chamber without hesitation. Every carefully hidden suspicion Emily Parker had carried for weeks suddenly transformed into certainty. Her heart raced as memories connected one after another. The corridor table he avoided. The numerical mistakes he corrected. The emotions he sensed before anyone spoke. The way he always seemed aware of details no blind man should have known. It had all been true. And now everyone knew it. Damien stood calmly in the center of the chamber while shock rippled through nobles, advisors, scholars, and diplomats alike. Some looked embarrassed. Others appeared stunned. Several exchanged nervous glances as though replaying every conversation they had held during the previous months. The Alpha King allowed the silence to linger. Not as punishment, as truth. Eventually he spoke. His voice remained steady and controlled. When news of my condition spread through the kingdom, many people revealed who they truly were. No one interrupted. Damien's gaze moved across the assembled court. Some remained loyal. Some remained honorable. Others changed the moment they believed I had become weaker. Several nobles lowered their eyes. Emily noticed faces she recognized. Men and women who had spoken differently since the rumors began. Advisors who had grown careless. Courtiers who had mistaken physical limitation for diminished leadership. Damien continued. Power often hides character. Remove certainty and character becomes visible. The chamber remained silent. Nobody wished to be the first person to speak. Then Damien turned toward Emily. Hundreds of eyes followed. Emily suddenly felt exposed beneath the attention of the entire court. She wanted nothing more than to disappear into the background. Yet there was nowhere to go. Damien approached her. Not quickly. Not dramatically. Simply with the calm confidence that had always defined him. When he stopped beside her, his expression softened slightly. Emily Parker. Hearing her name echo through the chamber made her heart skip. Damien turned back toward the assembled nobles. During these past months, one person never altered her behavior. Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks. One person showed respect without expectation of reward. One person spoke honestly. One person offered assistance without seeking recognition. The words seemed to settle across the room. Damien continued. While others focused on what they believed I had lost, she demonstrated abilities they failed to see. Scholars nodded immediately. Advisors exchanged knowing glances. The Norhaven representative smiled. Everyone remembered the treaty meeting. Everyone remembered who had solved the crisis. Damien looked toward the diplomatic delegation. The recent negotiations succeeded because Emily recognized what experts overlooked. He turned toward the scholars. The library dispute was resolved because she understood what specialists could not explain. Then his gaze returned to the court. And throughout it all, she never once sought attention. The room remained completely still. For perhaps the first time in her life, Emily realized that people were not merely looking at her. They were seeing her. Truly seeing her. Not as a servant. Not as a maid. Not as background scenery inside someone else's story. As herself. Damien allowed several moments to pass before speaking again. Titles matter. His voice echoed gently through the chamber. Experience matters. Position matters. But none of those things matter more than character, integrity, and wisdom. Several heads bowed. Nobody argued. Nobody could. The evidence stood before them. Then came the moment Emily would remember for the rest of her life. Damien formally announced her appointment as Royal Cultural and Linguistic Advisor to the Crown. The title carried responsibilities beyond anything she had imagined when arriving at Blackwood Palace. A murmur swept through the chamber. Not outrage. Not disbelief. Respect. Genuine respect. Emily could hardly breathe. The palace maid who arrived through the gates only weeks earlier suddenly found herself standing at the beginning of an entirely different future. Damien looked at her one final time. His expression carried something she had never seen before. Trust. Complete and unquestionable trust. Outside the stained-glass windows, snow continued falling across Blackwood Kingdom. Winter sunlight illuminated the chamber in shades of gold and silver. The world looked almost unchanged. Yet everything had changed. The secret was gone. The masks had fallen. Truth stood in the open where everyone could see it. And as applause gradually filled the chamber, Emily realized the greatest surprise was not that the Alpha King had been watching all along. It was that he had seen her long before anyone else did.